Welcome, weary traveller, to a journey through the sands of time. As you settle in for a night's repose, let us paint a vivid picture of an ancient world, a world of power, grandeur and cruelty. Tonight, we delve into the lives of the cruelest pharaohs to ever rule the land of Egypt, those god-kings whose actions echo through history. Before we begin our tale, I kindly ask you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're joining us from and what time of day it is for you. Are you nestled in bed as the sun sets, or perhaps stealing a moment of calm in the midst of a busy day? Wherever you are, whenever you are, we're glad to have you along for the ride. And if you find yourself enjoying this type of calm, immersive storytelling, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. There are many more journeys into history to come. But for now, let your mind drift back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile, where civilization first flourished under the watchful gaze of pharaohs. These rulers were more than just men. They were living gods, wielding absolute power over their land and subjects. With the briefest of commands, they could raise armies, build monuments, or snuff out lives. Their whims shaped the course of nations. Yet even among these exalted rulers, some pharaohs were more brutal than the rest. Their cruelty is legendary, whispered about by the people they terrorized and recorded in the annals of history. These are the pharaohs whose names still send a shiver down the spine, whose acts of ruthlessness echo through the ages. What drove these men to such extremes? Was it the pressure of their divine mandate, the expectation to rule with an iron fist? Was it the temptations of ultimate power, corrupting even the noblest of intentions? Or was it something darker, a twisted thirst for suffering that could never be slaked? These are the questions we'll explore as we wind our way through Egypt's blood-soaked history. We'll meet pharaohs who saw cruelty as a means to an end, who crushed their enemies and subjugated their people in the name of order and legacy. But we'll also encounter those for whom cruelty was the end in itself, men consumed by madness and sadism. Along the way, we'll paint a vivid picture of what it was like to live under these tyrants. The back-breaking labor of slaves erecting pyramids in the scorching sun, the fear of courtiers treading on eggshells in gilded palaces, never knowing when they might incur a fatal wrath. The desperation of common people praying for relief from their living gods. This is a journey into the shadows of human nature, into the depths of what man is capable of when given unchecked power. But it's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the countless lives that persevered in the face of unimaginable hardship. So settle in, dear listener, and let the sounds of the ancient world lull you into another time. The warm winds are blowing through the date palms, the cicadas are humming their lullabies, and the Nile is gently lapping at its banks. Close your eyes and let yourself sink into the distant past as we begin our first tale of the cruelest pharaoh. Long before the Great Pyramids rose from the desert sands, in the early days of a newly united Egypt, there ruled a pharaoh named Jer. He was the third king of the first dynasty, a time when the concept of absolute divine rule was still young, and Jer was determined to cement his grip on power, no matter the cost. Little is known for certain about Jer's reign, but the fragments of history that survive paint a grim picture. He's said to have been a brutal unifier, ruthlessly crushing any rival factions that dared challenge his authority. With each victory, his reputation grew, as did his appetite for cruelty. One grisly legend holds that after a particularly bloody campaign, Jer rounded up the severed hands of his vanquished foes as trophies. Imagine the scene, piles upon piles of lifeless hands stacked like cordwood in the hot Egyptian sun. A gruesome testament to the price of defiance. But Jer's cruelty wasn't limited to his enemies. He's said to have demanded the deaths of servants to accompany him into the afterlife, a practice that would become a disturbing trend among pharaohs to come. Perhaps he believed their souls would serve him in death as they had in life. Or perhaps it was simply a flex of his power, a reminder that his dominion extended even beyond the grave. Whatever the reason, the result was a reign of terror that set a chilling precedent. Djer may have united Egypt, but he did so through blood and fear. In a way, he was the prototype for the cruel pharaohs to come, an early warning of what can happen when absolute power goes unchecked. As the first dynasty faded into the second and then the third, Egypt continued to grow in wealth and power. Mighty monuments began to rise along the Nile, testaments to the godlike might of the pharaohs. But with each passing generation, it seemed their cruelty only grew in turn. Which brings us to our next pharaoh, a man whose name is still synonymous with tyranny and excess. Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Though he lived over 1,000 years after Djer, Khufu took the concept of divine cruelty to staggering new heights, quite literally, in the case of his most enduring legacy. The Great Pyramid is a wonder of the ancient world, a tomb fit for a god-king. Even today, it's hard to fathom the sheer scale of its construction. Imagine the toil involved, the decades of ceaseless labor by tens of thousands of workers. Now imagine doing it all under the merciless gaze of a tyrant. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus paints a grim picture of life under Khufu. He describes the pharaoh as a cruel and profligate ruler who subjugated his people to satisfy his own vanity. To fund his pyramid project, Herodotus claims Khufu resorted to desperate measures, even going so far as to prostitute his own daughter when the coffers ran low. While modern scholars debate the accuracy of these specific claims, there's little doubt that Khufu's reign was one of great hardship for the average Egyptian. The logistical challenges alone of constructing the Great Pyramid are staggering. Countless workers toiled in the scorching desert heat, cutting and hauling immense limestone blocks, all to satisfy the whims of one man. Grim stories abound of the human toll involved. Workers crushed under falling blocks, executed for the slightest infractions, even buried alive in the foundations as a macabre sacrifice. Some say the mortar between the stones was mixed with the blood, sweat, and tears of the slaves who built it. Of course, the historical record is murky, and such stories may well be exaggerations, but they speak to the reputation Khufu left behind, a reputation of a merciless taskmaster, a man who saw his subjects as expendable in the pursuit of his own glory. In the end, Khufu got his wish. His pyramid has endured for over 4,500 years, a testament to his power and ego. But at what cost? How many lives were ground to dust in the process? How much suffering was deemed an acceptable price for one man's vanity? These are the questions that haunt the legacy of Khufu. He may have built a wonder of the world, but he did so on a foundation of cruelty. In that way, he set a troubling precedent for the pharaohs to come, a model of ruthless absolutism in the name of ambition. And yet, as brutal as Khufu's reign was, it pales in comparison to the cruelty of our next pharaoh. A man who took the throne at just 6 years old and went on to rule for an astonishing 94 years. A man whose pampered youth and decadent reign would plunge Egypt into a dark age of tyranny and excess. The pharaoh in question is Pepi II, and his is a tale of cruelty unchecked. Born into the 6th dynasty, Pepi was just a child when his father died, and he ascended to the throne. You can imagine the kind of upbringing such a boy king would have, doted on by fawning courtiers, his every whim indulged, never hearing the word no. As Pepi grew into manhood, his appetite for luxury and power grew with him. The ancient historian Manetho describes him as a decadent ruler, more interested in his own pleasures than the welfare of his people. He's said to have had a harem of beautiful women at his beck and call, and to have indulged in all manner of excesses. But Pepi's self-indulgence came at a steep price. To fund his extravagant lifestyle, he ruthlessly taxed his subjects, driving many into poverty and despair. Those who couldn't pay were subjected to brutal punishments, beaten, imprisoned, even executed as a warning to others. Pepi was also fiercely paranoid, seeing threats to his power around every corner. He's said to have ruthlessly eliminated any potential rivals, even those within his own family. One grim tale speaks of him ordering the execution of his own uncle, a man who had served as his regent during his youth. Imagine the fear that must have gripped the palace during Pepi's reign. Courtiers walking on eggshells, never knowing when a stray word or perceived slight might bring down the wrath of the pharaoh. In such an atmosphere of terror, it's no wonder that corruption and cronyism ran rampant. And yet, even as his kingdom crumbled around him, Pepi clung to power with an iron grip. Year after year, decade after decade, he remained on the throne, a testament to his ruthlessness and cunning. In the end, Pepi's reign lasted an astonishing 94 years, the longest of any pharaoh in history. But those years were a plague upon Egypt. By the time he finally died, the kingdom was in chaos, riven by corruption and misrule. In a way, Pepi's reign was the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. A spoiled child growing into a tyrant, concerned only with his own pleasures while his people suffered. A man so cruel, so decadent, that his name became synonymous with the worst excesses of pharaonic rule. And yet, even Pepi's cruelty pales in comparison to our next pharaoh, a man who upended the very foundations of Egyptian society in the name of his own megalomania. A man who plunged his kingdom into a reign of religious terror unmatched in Egyptian history. That man was Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, and his is a story of cruelty in the name of fanaticism. Born Amenhotep IV, he rose to power in the prosperous 18th dynasty. But prosperity wasn't enough for this pharaoh. He had a grander vision, a vision of a new Egypt, a new kingdom centered around a single, all-powerful God. That God was Aten, the disk of the sun, and Akhenaten was his prophet. In a shocking move, the pharaoh declared that all other gods were false idols, that only Aten was to be worshipped throughout the land. It was a religious revolution, and Akhenaten would use any means to see it through. Imagine the scene as the pharaoh's decree spread throughout Egypt. Temples to the old gods being shut down, their priests dragged away in chains. Statues and inscriptions being defaced, the names of once revered deities chiseled away as if they had never existed. And everywhere, the watchful eye of the Aten, symbol of Akhenaten's power. For the average Egyptian, it must have been a terrifying time. The gods they had worshipped for generations were now forbidden, their very beliefs declared heretical. Those who clung to the old ways faced brutal punishment, torture, imprisonment, even execution in the name of the Aten. Even the elite weren't safe from Akhenaten's religious fervor. One of his most shocking acts was to shut down the powerful temple of Amun at Karnak, seizing its vast wealth and lands for his own use. The priests who resisted were subjected to horrific fates, some flayed alive, others buried up to their necks and left to die in the scorching sun. Through it all, Akhenaten remained convinced of his own righteousness. He saw himself as a visionary, a revolutionary destined to lead his people into a glorious new age. But in reality, he was a tyrant, a man so consumed by his own fanaticism that he was willing to tear his kingdom apart to achieve it. In the end, Akhenaten's reign was short-lived. After his death, the old gods were quickly restored, and his name was stricken from history. A fitting end for a pharaoh whose cruelty knew no bounds. But his legacy would live on as a warning about the dangers of religious extremism, of the horrors that can be unleashed in the name of an idea. As we move into the 19th dynasty, we come to a pharaoh whose cruelty was of a different sort, the cruelty of conquest and empire building. I speak of Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, one of the most celebrated and notorious rulers in Egyptian history. Ramesses was a pharaoh with big ambitions. From the moment he took the throne, he set his sights on expanding Egypt's borders and asserting its dominance over the surrounding lands. He was a skilled warrior and a ruthless tactician, and he would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. One of Ramesses' most famous campaigns was his war against the Hittites, a powerful empire centered in what is now Turkey. The two superpowers clashed in a series of epic battles, with Ramesses leading his armies from the front lines. Ancient inscriptions vividly describe the pharaoh's valor in combat, how he personally charged into the fray and slew his foes with a strength unmatched. But bravery alone doesn't make a great leader. For all his military prowess, Ramesses could also be brutally cruel to those he conquered. After one particularly decisive victory, he's said to have rounded up the survivors and executed them en masse, a grim warning to any who would dare defy him. This was par for the course for Ramesses. Wherever his armies went, they left a trail of destruction in their wake. Cities were sacked, crops burned, populations enslaved or slaughtered, all in the name of Egyptian glory and the pharaoh's own ego. And what an ego it was. Ramesses was a master of self-promotion, and he made sure his name and image were etched into every corner of his empire. He erected massive statues of himself, some over 100 feet tall, and emblazoned his cartouche on seemingly every wall and pillar. But perhaps his greatest monument was the city of Ramesses, his new capital built on the edge of the Nile Delta. It was a marvel of engineering and a testament to Ramesses' power. A vast complex of palaces, temples, and estates sprawling over 18 square miles. Of course, such grandeur came at a cost. Ramesses ruthlessly conscripted laborers to work on his building projects, subjecting them to grueling conditions under the desert sun. Many died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or sheer overwork. Their lives a small price to pay for the pharaoh's vision. In the end, Ramesses' cruelty served his aims well. By the time of his death, Egypt was at the height of its power, its borders stretching from Syria to Sudan. Ramesses had gotten his wish, an empire to match his outsized ambition and ego. But at what cost? How many lives had been crushed under the wheels of his war machine? How much suffering had been inflicted in the name of glory? These are the questions that dog Ramesses' legacy, the dark underbelly of his celebrated reign. As we move into the later dynasties, we return to a pharaoh whose cruelty we've already touched on, Akhenaten, the heretic king. But if his religious fervor was shocking, it's nothing compared to the depths of madness and sadism he would ultimately sink to. As Akhenaten's reign progressed, his obsession with his sun god Aten only intensified. He became increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies and conspiracies around every corner. Anyone who didn't show sufficient devotion to Aten was a potential threat, a traitor to be rooted out and destroyed. The pharaoh's madness took on a cruel and capricious edge. He's said to have ordered executions on a whim, subjecting his courtiers to a constant state of terror. Even his own family wasn't safe. According to some accounts, he banished his wife Nefertiti for daring to suggest that he might be going too far. But perhaps the cruelest act of Akhenaten's reign was his abandonment of Thebes, the traditional capital of Egypt. In a shocking move, he ordered the construction of a new city in the middle of the desert, a place that would be dedicated solely to the worship of Aten. The city was called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and its construction was a nightmare. Thousands of workers were forced to toil in the scorching heat. As Ramesses III took the throne, Egypt was a land scarred by tumult and strife. The once great empire had been brought to its knees by the cruelty and chaos of pharaohs past. Akhenaten's religious upheavals, Ramesses II's bruising wars, and the bloody power struggles in between had left the two lands weary and wounded. The people cried out for a ruler to lead them back to stability and glory. But in a time where cruelty begat cruelty, peace would prove elusive. Rameses III was a man shaped by this turbulent age. Born into the royal family during the troubled years after Akhenaten, his youth was steeped in intrigue and unrest. As a prince, he watched rivals vie for power, courtiers scheme and conspire, and pretenders plot to seize the throne of Horus. This was a dangerous world, where one false step could mean a traitor's death. To survive and rise, Rameses would need cunning, ruthlessness, and an iron will to match any foe. When his moment came, Rameses acted with decisive brutality. The records are murky, but glimpses of the truth peek through the mists of time. Whispers of a palace coup, a royalist faction rallying to the prince's banner, murmurs of bloody battles as Rameses and his supporters cut down their rivals without mercy, furtive tales of executions and exiles as the would-be king purged any who dared stand against him. Through naked cruelty and force of arms, Rameses III made himself the undisputed master of Egypt. But seizing power was only the first trial Rameses would face. All around, the empire was beset by foes and afflicted by woes. To the west, the Libyans menaced the desert frontiers, probing for weakness and plunder. To the east, the sea peoples raged and ravaged, surging from their unknown lands to batter the very foundations of Egyptian might. In the south, Nubia stirred and plotted, dreaming of slipping the yoke of pharaonic rule. Beset on all sides, Egypt teetered on the precipice. Rameses III knew his reign would be defined by how he met these threats. A king who flinched in the face of danger could not hope to hold the double crown for long. And so, Rameses girded himself for war, determined to crush his enemies with the full force of Egyptian arms. He would make his foes tremble before the might of Horus, avenger of his father, or see Egypt perish in the attempt. With merciless resolve, Rameses marched forth to meet the Libyans on the field of battle. The pharaoh was a vision of martial splendor in his war chariot, his Khopesh sword flashing in the sun, his blue battle crown striking terror into the hearts of his foes. With precise and pitiless force, Rameses drove the Libyans before him, scattering their armies like chaff on the wind. Captives were marched back to Egypt in chains, their leaders brutally maimed to make an example to any who dared defy the son of Ra. But there was no time to savor this victory, for the sea peoples were storming the very gates of Egypt. These enigmatic raiders from beyond the Great Green Sea had toppled empires and set the world ablaze with their fury. Now they descended on the Nile Delta like a hurricane, razing cities and sowing chaos wherever their oars touched shore. If they could not be stopped, Egypt itself might be swallowed by the raging sea. Once more Rameses rode out to war, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon with steely determination. In a series of ferocious battles, the pharaoh unleashed the full might of his armies against the sea peoples. Egyptian infantry clashed with foreign raiders in brutal hand-to-hand combat, while flotillas of sleek warships grappled on the churning waves. The din of bronze and the cries of the dying filled the air as Rameses fought with the strength of Set, the fury of Montu. Through sheer grit and martial prowess, Rameses III prevailed against the sea peoples, driving them from Egypt's shores and scattering their broken remnants to the four winds. It was a victory that echoed through the ages, immortalized on the storied walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. There, vivid reliefs depict the pharaoh as a warrior without peer, smiting hordes of sea peoples and receiving their abject submission. The artisan's chisels sing a hymn to Ramesses' glory, etching his deeds into eternity. But even in triumph, the spectre of cruelty was never far from Rameses III. For the pharaoh who lived by the sword would also perish by it, victim of a shadowy conspiracy that reached into the very heart of his own harem. The details are lost to time, obscured by ominous lacunae in the ancient scrolls. But the grim outcome is all too clear. Ramesses III, the saviour of Egypt, cut down by treachery most foul. As the king lay dying, his life's blood ebbing into the unyielding stone, perhaps his thoughts flew back to the brutal path that had brought him to this pass. A lifetime steeped in blood and cruelty, a reign forged in the crucible of merciless warfare and ruthless ambition. Had the gods demanded too steep a price for Egypt's salvation? Or was this the inexorable fate of all who dared to wear the double crown, to wield the crook and flail of absolute power? These are questions that echo through the ages, as inscrutable as the Sphinx that gazes out across the desert sands. The cruel pharaohs of Egypt's past may be lost to history, their names faded to legend and myth, but their blood-soaked legacy endures, a testament to the eternal struggle between power and morality, ambition and consequence. In their triumphs and their failures, in their glories and their cruelties, these pharaohs hold up a mirror to the human condition itself. As we contemplate these ancient lives from the comfort of our modern age, it is easy to pass judgment, to recoil in horror at the excesses of unchecked power. But perhaps, in the quiet moments before sleep claims us, we might also pause to reflect on the burdens borne by those who don the mantle of leadership, the lonely weight of decisions that echo through eternity, the terrible price paid by those who would shape the course of nations and civilizations. In the end, the cruel pharaohs of Egypt's past remind us of the double-edged nature of power itself. It is a force that can build wonders and forge empires, but also a force that can corrupt and destroy in equal measure. To wield such power is to walk a razor's edge, forever balanced between greatness and ruin. This is the burden of kings and conquerors, the eternal dilemma of those who would seek to bend history to their will. As we drift into the waiting arms of sleep, let us ponder these timeless lessons from the distant past. For in the rise and fall of pharaohs cruel and mighty, we may yet find echoes of our own struggles and triumphs, our own hopes and fears. The sands of time may blow, the ages may turn, but the essence of the human drama remains unchanged, as enduring as the pyramids that loom eternal against the horizon of history. Under the blistering Egyptian sun, the merciless reign of Ramesses II ground on, year after year, decade after decade. The pharaoh's cruelty knew no bounds as he relentlessly pursued his own glory at any cost. Countless slaves toiled and perished to build his colossal monuments, towering statues, sprawling temples, and grandiose tombs that would ensure Ramesses' name endured for eternity. The king's agents scoured the land, pressing peasants into backbreaking labour and viciously quashing any hint of dissent. Woe to those who dared resist the pharaoh's will. They faced lashings, disfigurement, or a grisly public execution as a warning to others. Beyond his unquenchable thirst for architectural splendour, Ramesses II was also a ruthlessly ambitious conqueror, hell-bent on expanding Egypt's might. He fixed his sights on the lands of Nubia to the south and the Hittite Empire to the northeast. With each new campaign, the great war machine of Egypt rumbled into motion. Legions of soldiers marched out across the burning desert sands, their bronze weapons glinting in the harsh sun. They descended on enemy towns like a plague of locusts, leaving destruction and misery in their wake. Ramesses himself often rode at the vanguard, his cruel eyes flashing as he savoured each new conquest. The Hittites bore the brunt of the pharaoh's wrath. For years, the two superpowers grappled for control of strategic outposts in Syria. In his most famous and brutal campaign, Ramesses II marshalled a force of 20,000 men and marched on the pivotal city of Kadesh. The ensuing battle was fierce and bloody, filling the Orontes River with broken chariots and bodies. Both sides suffered grievous losses, but Ramesses spun it as a great victory. Flush with triumph, the king returned to Egypt, and unleashed a building spree unlike any before. He cruelly forced his Hittite captives to labor on his grandest projects, in a grim echo of the Hebrews' later toil. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel all bore the stamp of Ramesses' ruthless ambition and the blood and sweat of untold slaves. Yet perhaps the cruelest stroke of Ramesses' reign was not on the battlefield or in the quarry, but within his own family. The pharaoh sired over 100 children with a parade of wives, seeing them as little more than pawns to secure the line of succession. He notoriously groomed his 13th son Meremptar to inherit the throne, coldly snubbing and isolating the 12 older brothers. This sowed bitter strife and resentment within the royal family. Ramesses played his children off against each other, pitting brother against brother in a high-stakes game of rivalry. He dangled power before them, but reacted viciously to any hint of a challenge to his authority. The crown prince Amun-Herkhepeshef dared to outshine his father, and was never heard from again. Thus, Ramesses II's cruelty cast a long shadow over Egypt, one that would linger for generations after his passing. He had ruthlessly expanded its borders and raised monuments to his own glory, but at a steep price in human suffering. The king was revered, but also deeply feared. It's said that when he died after 67 years on the throne, the first question on every Egyptian's lips was not one of grief, but a hushed, anxious, "Who will be pharaoh now?" They trembled at the prospect of a new tyrant rising, or worse, a war of succession between Ramesses' many sons that would drench the kingdom in blood. Memories were still fresh of the dynastic chaos that had ripped Egypt apart after Akhenaten's reign a century before. Would one of Ramesses' overlooked older boys, seething with resentment, make a brutal play for power? In the end, the transfer to Meremptar was largely peaceful, if not especially smooth. The 13th son navigated court intrigues and fended off rivals to secure his rule. But in many ways, he proved a pale shadow of his domineering father, struggling to hold together the empire Ramesses had assembled. And so Egypt entered a slow decline, never quite recapturing the heights of wealth and power it had known under its most infamous king. Ramesses II's cruelty had brought the kingdom to the pinnacle of its strength, but also sowed the seeds of its gradual decay. It was a pattern that would echo again and again throughout Egypt's long history. The higher a pharaoh's ambitions soared on the backs of his battered subjects, the harder the fall of the dynasty to come. As we lie back and close our eyes, the story of Ramesses the Great drifts through our thoughts, still vivid after thousands of years. There's a timeless lesson in his reign, if we care to heed it, a warning of what becomes of a society that embraces cruelty over compassion. One can only wonder, what dreams haunted Ramesses as he lay in his own royal bed, the screams of slaves and conquered foes still echoing in his ears? What regrets and doubts churned behind those imperious eyes as the great king drifted off to a restless sleep? Questions we'll likely never answer, but ones that linger with us as we too surrender to slumber's embrace, the fading spectre of Ramesses' cruelty trailing us into the realm of dreams. There, we may just catch a ghostly glimpse of ancient Egypt's bloodied sands and toiling slaves, and shiver at the shadow of its most infamous pharaoh. Perhaps, as we sink deeper into sleep's dark waters, we'll find ourselves adrift on the Nile of 3,000 years ago, its current carrying us inexorably into the mists of history. And if we glance over our shoulder, we may just spy a monumental statue rising from the riverbank, the face of Ramesses the Great looming through the fading light. His stony eyes forever fixed on eternity's horizon, even as the kingdom he built with such cruelty crumbles slowly to dust behind him. With that image dancing dimly through our thoughts, we can at last let the story go and give ourselves over to sleep's welcome embrace. The long ago cruelty of Ramesses II recedes into the shadows of history and dream, a dark reminder of the eternal truth. that it is not the mightiest pharaohs we recall and cherish, but the ones who ruled with wisdom, justice, and mercy for the people they led. Such were the mysterious ways of ancient Egypt, land of god-kings and unending intrigue. And so, our weary minds wander those shifting desert sands until the veil of sleep descends at last and carries us into oblivion's silent keep, where the cruelest pharaohs lie entombed with their secrets for all eternity. There they will remain, gilded and mummified, with only their whispered tales left to echo through our dreams on nights like this. As the first twinkling stars emerge in the darkening sky above the Nile, the absolute power of the pharaohs often corrupted absolutely. Insulated by unfathomable wealth and worshipped as living gods, many were shaped into tyrants. The expectations heaped upon their shoulders from birth to be an invincible ruler, a supreme judge, a divine intermediary between heaven and earth, could twist even the most well-meaning sovereign. Some pharaohs shouldered this immense responsibility with wisdom and restraint, but for others, it nurtured the cruelest impulses. Perhaps no pharaoh embodied the perils of unchecked power more than Jer, an early ruler of the First Dynasty. Rising to the throne after Egypt's unification, Jer was determined to stamp out any threat to his rule. According to fragmentary records and archaeological remnants, Jer brutally executed rival claimants and potential usurpers. Even those merely suspected of plotting against him were put to death in the most gruesome ways, impaled, flayed alive, fed to wild beasts. He demanded slavish loyalty from his subjects, and any hint of disobedience could be punished by mutilation or death. Jer's cruelty extended even into the afterlife. Archaeologists believe he had hundreds of servants and loyal officials sacrificed upon his death so they could continue serving him in the next world. Their bodies were buried in neat rows near his tomb, a macabre display of his power. This grim practice set a precedent followed by many later kings. Jer's example showed that a pharaoh's capacity for cruelty need not end at the grave. While Jer's ruthlessness crushed dissent, it couldn't build monuments that would endure for millennia. That feat would fall to Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. This colossal tomb is a testament to Khufu's power and the merciless means he employed to build it. Its construction consumed Khufu's lengthy reign, becoming an obsession bordering on madness. For over 20 years, armies of workers toiled on the pyramid under the desert sun. Peasants were torn from farms and families and pressed into hard labor cutting, hauling, and stacking immense limestone blocks. Skilled craftsmen, architects, and engineers were forced to dedicate their entire lives to Khufu's grand vision. The work was backbreaking, and the human cost was immense. Contemporary accounts describe workers beaten to death by overseers for flagging at their ceaseless toil. Accidents on the massive building site were common, with crushed limbs and fatal falls a daily occurrence. Some deceased workers were unceremoniously sealed into the pyramid's very foundations. Even by ancient standards, the conditions Khufu's workforce endured were considered cruel and exploitative. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years later, described Khufu as vicious and depraved for inflicting such misery to build his tomb. But to Khufu, their suffering was inconsequential compared to the magnificence of his monument. The pyramid was an eternal beacon of his glory, and no cost was too high, especially when paid by lowly laborers. Khufu's cruelty literally towered over Egypt for all to see. If Khufu showed the depths of cruelty a pharaoh would sink to for a lasting legacy, Pepi II demonstrated how absolute power could warp a ruler over a lifetime. Ascending to the throne at just 6 years old, Pepi's 94-year reign was the longest in ancient Egyptian history. Child kings were not uncommon, but they ruled in name only, with advisors wielding the real power behind the throne. In Pepi's case, his early years were spent in pampered isolation in the royal court. Away from the burdens of governance, he grew into a spoiled, impulsive youth with no check on his whims and appetites. When he came of age, Pepi jealously seized control as pharaoh in truth, not just in name. Paranoid that others would steal his power as he once had as a child, Pepi ruthlessly eliminated any hint of a threat. Advisors who had served him since infancy were exiled or executed on spurious charges. Pepi promoted only the most slavishly loyal sycophants, who enabled his every cruel impulse. The inner circle of Pepi's court became a den of intrigue and treachery, where courtiers vied for his favour. Outside the palace walls, Pepi's reign devolved into tyranny and terror. Political rivals and disloyal governors were publicly tortured and executed as warnings. Oppressive taxes were extracted to fund Pepi's decadent lifestyle and self-glorifying building projects. According to some accounts, Pepi hosted macabre banquets where the bodies of executed enemies were displayed and desecrated. Other tales claim he kept a harem of enslaved women who were killed if they displeased him. While the truth of such stories is hard to verify, they paint a chilling picture of a ruler corrupted by his own power. Pepi's cruelty and misrule helped plunge Egypt into a dark age of decline and chaos after his death. With no strong heir to follow his 94-year reign, political instability and economic collapse ravaged the kingdom for over a century. Pepi's corrupt court and government could not endure without him. The suffering and havoc his tyranny unleashed would far outlast the material splendor of his reign. Pepi's lifetime of cruelty brought Egypt to ruin. While Pepi II's cruelty stemmed from indulgence and insecurity, Akhenaten's sprung from fanaticism and fervor. A pharaoh of the prosperous 18th dynasty, Akhenaten believed he had a divine mandate to transform Egypt's religious order. In the 5th year of his reign, he instituted a sweeping upheaval to install worship of a single sun deity, the Aten, as the state religion. It was a bold attempt to focus religious power and resources under his control as pharaoh, high priest, and divine intermediary of the Aten. To Akhenaten, this was not merely a political power grab. It was a righteous revolution against centuries of religious tradition. Anything short of total compliance was seen as heresy against divine will. He commanded the closure of temples to the old gods across Egypt. Long-venerated deities like Amun, Osiris, and Isis were officially abandoned, and their priesthoods disbanded. Disloyal priests who refused to comply were imprisoned, exiled, or executed as traitors. Their wealth and landholdings were seized by the royal treasury. Only the most zealously loyal converts were allowed to remain. But Akhenaten's vision of a pure Aten-worshipping utopia demanded further sacrifices. Armies of workers were conscripted to chisel away inscriptions of the old gods from every public monument. Sanctuaries and shrines that had stood for generations were razed to the ground. Mob violence and vandalism against the old gods' followers were tacitly encouraged. At Akhenaten's command, Egypt's pluralistic religious culture was brutally suppressed in a campaign of iconoclasm and inquisition. For ordinary Egyptians, it was a time of fear, chaos, and spiritual loss. The gods and rituals that had shaped their lives for centuries were now forbidden on pain of death. The only faith allowed was Akhenaten's stern monotheism, where the pharaoh alone communed with the supreme solar deity. Many struggled to adapt to the austere new ideology and worship. Others simmered with quiet resentment at the king who so callously overturned their cherished traditions. Though undertaken in the name of pious reform, Akhenaten's religious revolution cracked the foundations of Egyptian society and brought his people immense hardship. But perhaps no pharaoh wielded cruelty as effectively as Ramesses II in the service of building an empire. Often called Ramesses the Great, He ruled for a remarkable 66 years and presided over an era of military expansion and monumental construction. His reign saw Egypt grow into one of the largest and most powerful empires of the ancient world, with Ramesses as its indomitable ruler. Behind this imperial grandeur was an engine of conquest and cruelty. To expand Egypt's borders, Ramesses waged a series of brutal military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms. His most famous were the wars against the Hittites of Anatolia, a powerful rival empire. At the Battle of Kadesh, the largest chariot clash in antiquity, Ramesses led his army to a decisive victory. Reliefs celebrating the triumph show Ramesses slaughtering enemies by the hundreds, trampling their bodies beneath his chariot wheels. Such vivid propaganda projected an image of Ramesses as an invincible warrior king, and the cruelties of war were depicted as displays of his might. Prisoners were marched back to Egypt as slaves, their homelands turned into vassal states. Closer to home, Ramesses launched punitive raids into Nubia to the south, sacking cities and enslaving captives. No slight against Egyptian power could go unpunished. The wealth seized through Ramesses' conquests funded a frenzy of building across Egypt. He commissioned scores of new temples, monuments, and cities, all bearing his name and image. The sheer scale and number of Ramesses' building projects was unprecedented, but they took a brutal human toll. Armies of slaves, POWs, and peasants were pressed into back-breaking labor to build Ramesses' many monuments. They toiled in squalid conditions, often under the whip, to haul stone and raise statues glorifying the king. Massive rock-cut temples like Abu Simbel consumed untold lives as laborers worked deep underground. The new capital Pi-Ramesses was built on the backs of foreign slaves who were worked to death far from home. For Ramesses, this suffering was a small price to pay for the greater glory of his reign. Each monument was a testament to his power and divine mandate to rule. If it took cruelty and conquest to achieve immortality, so be it. The blood spilled and lives spent were just the cost of building an eternal empire. But Ramesses could not control his legacy from beyond the grave. Later pharaohs, intimidated by his accomplishments, began to claim his monuments as their own. Some even chiseled out his name and replaced it with theirs, an act of posthumous theft. For a king obsessed with eternal glory, there could be no greater cruelty. Of course, no chronicle of pharaonic cruelty could omit the depths of depravity reached by Akhenaten. While his religious inquisition upended the spiritual foundations of Egypt, his personal rule devolved into a nightmare of madness and paranoia. As his reign wore on, Akhenaten grew increasingly obsessed with his role as the sole intermediary to the Aten. In his mind, any disloyalty was an affront to divine order, and his delusions fed the cruelest impulses. Within the royal court, Akhenaten unleashed a reign of terror against suspected traitors and religious backsliders. Servants and advisors could be imprisoned, mutilated, or executed on the barest suspicion of unbelief. Even his own family was not immune. According to some accounts, Akhenaten banished his wife Nefertiti and several daughters from court for not worshipping the Aten fervently enough. The royal palace became a hothouse of fear and sycophancy, but Akhenaten's cruelest act was yet to come. Not content to stamp out the old gods, he sought to raise a pure city dedicated to the Aten alone, Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun. He abandoned the capital Thebes and forced the entire apparatus of government to follow him to this barren patch of desert. There, he poured state resources into a deranged utopian project, while the rest of Egypt languished. Akhetaten was built with dizzying speed by press-ganged laborers, its palaces and temples rising from the sands in a matter of years. Nobles were required to construct lavish tombs in the nearby cliffs to prove their loyalty. Dissenters could face execution, with their bodies left to rot in the desert sun as a warning. The once bustling city of Thebes became a ghost town, its temples shuttered and population forced to resettle. All to satisfy the whims of a ruler lost in religious delusion. Akhenaten's cruel folly would not last. Mere years after his death, Akhetaten was abandoned, its palaces already crumbling back into sand. His religious revolution was swiftly reversed by the boy king Tutankhamun, and Akhenaten himself became a reviled figure, the heretic pharaoh whose name was chiseled from monuments. Few pharaohs have been so thoroughly erased from history by their own people. It was a fitting end for a ruler consumed by his own madness and cruelty. The fallout from Akhenaten's misrule would spawn further cruelties as Egypt entered a chaotic period of instability and violence. Rival claimants to the throne waged bitter power struggles in the absence of a strong ruler. Chiefs and warlords carved out their own fiefdoms as the reach of the central government broke down. Banditry and lawlessness reigned while the kingdom bled. From this upheaval would emerge another strongman pharaoh, Ramesses III, who seized power after a time of turmoil. To secure his rule, Ramesses ruthlessly crushed all opposition, real or imagined. According to court records, a harem conspiracy nearly succeeded in assassinating him, spurring bloody purges. Anyone suspected of involvement was tortured into confession before facing public execution. In a grim display of power, Ramesses had the ringleaders of the plot mutilated and impaled outside the palace gates. Other conspirators were allowed to commit suicide to avoid a worse fate, their noses and ears cut off before death. The royal harem was purged and restaffed, with women more strictly loyal to the king. Even Ramesses' own family was not above suspicion, with several sons eliminated as potential rivals. Having imposed a brutal peace at home, Ramesses III turned his cruelty outward to restore Egypt's battered empire. Like his namesake, Ramesses II, he embarked on aggressive military campaigns against foreign enemies. But his most significant achievement was defending Egypt against the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of Mediterranean raiders who threatened the entire Near East. Using the Egyptian navy, Ramesses repelled the Sea Peoples' invasion in a massive sea battle. Reliefs depicting the victory show the cruel fates meted out to the defeated. Many were bound and thrown overboard to drown or had their hands cut off as trophies. Those who survived were enslaved and forcibly resettled in Egypt as laborers. Once again, the cruelties of war were celebrated as signs of the pharaoh's power and glory. Ramesses III's cruelty may have held Egypt together in a time of crisis, but it could not reverse the kingdom's decline. The late New Kingdom saw a gradual erosion of pharaonic power and prestige over a succession of weaker rulers. The great days of conquest and expansion were over, and Egypt slowly slid into stagnation. A series of foreign invasions would reduce the might of the pharaohs to a shadow of their former selves. In the end, the cruelty of the pharaohs could command obedience, but not loyalty. Their capacity for brutality was constrained only by the material resources to enact it. When the wealth and power of Egypt faded, so too did their ability to casually inflict suffering and terror. The pharaohs profiled here represent the extremes of unchecked power. For centuries, Egyptian kings walked a fine line between godly duties and human cruelty. Those who indulged their worst impulses found that their actions often sowed the seeds for future calamities. The example of Akhenaten shows how one man's cruelty and folly could destabilize an entire society. Even Ramesses the Great, for all his accomplishments, was undone by his own hubris and need for eternal glory. But the cruelty of the pharaohs was not an aberration. It was enabled by a system that granted godlike powers to fallible humans. When that system finally crumbled, the age of the god kings went with it. What remains are the scars of their misrule, and the cautionary tales of their depraved deeds. The cruelest pharaohs may have achieved immortality, but not in the way they intended. Their acts of brutality and oppression serve as warnings about the dangers of absolute power, echoing across the centuries. So let the pharaohs of cruelty be remembered, but not revered. Let their stories be whispered as bedtime tales of caution and woe. And let the ruins of their monuments and shattered visages of their statues remind us that no matter how mighty, every tyrant eventually crumbles to dust. As sleep descends, ponder the choices that make a just ruler or a reviled despot. The past may be immutable, but the future is not yet written. In our dreams, we can aspire to wisdom over wickedness, compassion over cruelty. For in the end, what legacy do we leave behind? One of creation and kindness, or destruction and suffering? The weight of power is a heavy burden, but the weight of conscience is far greater still. So rest now and dream of a world where the mistakes of the past need not be repeated, where leaders are guided by justice and mercy, not megalomania and malice. And remember always the perils of power without restraint, as embodied by the cruelest pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Their whispered names are a warning through the ages, haunting our slumber with the spectre of unchecked tyranny. Let their memory be both a lullaby and a lesson, a grim gift from antiquity to light our way forward. And as Akhenaten's religious revolution descended into chaos and cruelty, his capital city of Thebes seethed with discontent. The pharaoh's single-minded devotion to the sun god Aten had upended centuries of tradition, and his increasingly erratic behavior sent shockwaves through Egyptian society. Akhenaten's paranoia grew with each passing day, fueled by the whispers of dissent reaching his ears. He became convinced that those closest to him were plotting against his reign and the glorious vision he had for Egypt. In a fit of madness, he ordered the banishment of his own wife, Nefertiti, a woman of great beauty and influence. Some say she spoke out against his reforms, one too many times. Others whisper that the pharaoh's fragile ego couldn't bear the thought of sharing power, even with his queen. With Nefertiti gone, Akhenaten's cruelty knew no bounds. He ordered the construction of a grand new capital in the middle of the desert, a city he called Akhetaten, or Horizon of the Aten. Thousands of slaves and workers toiled under the blistering sun to build a monument to the pharaoh's own vanity. They labored from dawn until dusk, hefting massive blocks of limestone to erect towering temples and palaces. Many dropped dead from exhaustion, their bodies left where they fell as a grim warning to others. Yet even as his new capital rose from the sands, Akhenaten's grip on reality was slipping. He became convinced that the god Aten spoke to him directly, whispering commands in his ear. The pharaoh began to issue increasingly bizarre decrees, like banning the worship of all other gods and even forbidding the use of the word gods in the plural. He ordered the destruction of any statues or inscriptions that dared to mention deities other than Aten. As word of Akhenaten's madness spread, a group of brave priests decided to take a stand. They gathered in secret to perform the sacred rituals of the old gods, praying for an end to the pharaoh's tyranny. But Akhenaten's spies were everywhere, and it wasn't long before the priests were dragged before the throne, their faces etched with defiance. In a chilling display of cruelty, Akhenaten ordered the priests to be publicly executed, their bodies mutilated and left to rot in the sun. He declared that anyone caught worshipping the old gods would suffer the same fate, sowing fear and despair throughout the land. As the years passed, Akhenaten's cruelty only intensified. He became increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow. He ordered the construction of a massive wall around his new capital, a futile attempt to keep out the growing tide of discontent. Inside the city, life was a nightmare of constant surveillance and brutal punishments. Even the slightest hint of disloyalty could result in torture or death. Yet even as he tightened his grip on power, Akhenaten's empire was crumbling around him. The economy was in shambles, the people were starving, and the once great civilization of Egypt was teetering on the brink of collapse. In his final years, the pharaoh became a ghost of his former self, a mad tyrant consumed by his own delusions of grandeur. When death finally came for Akhenaten, it was a bitter relief for his long-suffering subjects. The pharaoh's body was hastily buried in a small tomb, his name and legacy all but erased from history. In the end, his grand vision for a new Egypt had brought nothing but misery and ruin. As the dust settled on Akhenaten's reign, the people of Egypt looked to the future with a mix of hope and trepidation. The old gods were slowly restored to their rightful place, and the wounds of the past began to heal. But the scars of Akhenaten's cruelty would linger for generations, a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of a tyrant. In the centuries that followed, the story of Akhenaten faded into legend, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to their children. They spoke of a pharaoh consumed by his own madness, a man who dared to defy the gods and paid the ultimate price. And as the flickering torchlight cast shadows on the walls of their humble homes, the people of Egypt prayed that such cruelty would never again darken their land. But the echoes of Akhenaten's reign would continue to reverberate through Egyptian history, a grim prelude to the tumultuous times that lay ahead. For even as the old order was restored, new threats loomed on the horizon, waiting to plunge the empire into chaos once more. In the years following Akhenaten's death, Egypt descended into a period of political instability and social upheaval. The power vacuum left by the pharaoh's demise sparked a series of bitter power struggles as rival factions vied for control of the throne. Assassinations, coups, and bloody purges became the order of the day as the once mighty empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Amidst this chaos, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a young general named Ramesses. Born into a noble family with close ties to the throne, Ramesses had distinguished himself as a skilled warrior and a cunning strategist. As the country spiraled into disorder, he saw an opportunity to seize power and restore order to the land. With a small but loyal army at his back, Ramesses marched on the capital, his eyes fixed on the ultimate prize. In a series of bloody battles, he crushed all opposition, ruthlessly eliminating anyone who dared to stand in his way. By the time the dust settled, Ramesses had claimed the throne for himself, taking the name Ramesses III in honor of his illustrious ancestors. But Ramesses knew that his grip on power was tenuous at best. The country was still reeling from the aftermath of Akhenaten's reign, and there were many who sought to challenge his authority. To cement his rule, Ramesses embarked on a campaign of terror and intimidation, ruthlessly suppressing any hint of dissent. He began by rounding up those who had supported his rivals in the recent power struggle, subjecting them to brutal public executions. The lucky ones were simply beheaded, their severed heads displayed on pikes as a warning to others. But for those who had dared to openly defy him, Ramesses reserved a special kind of cruelty. Some were burned alive, their screams echoing through the streets as the flames consumed their flesh. Others were impaled on sharp stakes, left to suffer an agonizing death as the sun beat down on their writhing bodies. And still others were flayed alive, their skin peeled away inch by excruciating inch until nothing remained but a bloody, quivering mass of flesh. As word of these atrocities spread throughout the land, a palpable sense of fear and dread settled over the populace. No one was safe from Ramesses' wrath, it seemed. Not even the wealthy and powerful. The pharaoh's spies were everywhere, always watching, always listening for the slightest hint of treachery. Ramesses himself became a figure of terror, his very name enough to send shivers down the spines of his subjects. He was said to have a heart of pure evil, a soul as black as the darkest night. Some even whispered that he was not entirely human, that he had made a pact with the gods of the underworld to secure his place on the throne. But even as he tightened his grip on power, Ramesses knew that he could not rule by fear alone. To truly secure his legacy, he would need to prove himself a worthy successor to the great pharaohs of old. And so he embarked on a series of grand building projects, determined to leave his mark on the land. He ordered the construction of massive temples and monuments, each one more grand and opulent than the last. Thousands of slaves labored day and night to erect these towering structures, their bodies broken and their spirits crushed beneath the weight of Ramesses' ambition. Many died from exhaustion and disease, their bodies unceremoniously dumped in mass graves on the outskirts of the city. Yet even as his subjects suffered, Ramesses reveled in his own power and glory. He surrounded himself with sycophants and flatterers, basking in their empty praise and hollow adulation. In his mind, he was not just a pharaoh, he was a living god, the embodiment of divine power on earth. But the truth was far less grandiose. For all his bluster and bravado, Ramesses was a deeply insecure man, haunted by the spectre of his own mortality. He knew that his reign, like all reigns, would eventually come to an end, and that when it did, his name and deeds would be judged by the unforgiving lens of history. And so he clung to power with a desperate, almost feverish intensity, lashing out at anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He became increasingly paranoid and erratic, seeing enemies around every corner and conspiracy in every shadow. Even his own family was not safe from his suspicions. He had his own son executed for daring to question his decisions, and banished his wife to a remote desert outpost for failing to bear him a male heir. As the years wore on, Ramesses' cruelty and paranoia took an ever greater toll on his subjects. The once great civilization of Egypt began to crumble under the weight of his tyranny, as poverty, disease, and despair ravaged the land. Fields lay fallow, markets stood empty, and the once proud people of the Nile Valley became little more than broken, beaten shells of their former selves. And yet, even as his empire collapsed around him, Ramesses clung to his delusions of grandeur, convinced that he alone could save Egypt from the abyss. In his final years, he became a ghost of his former self, a mad, raving tyrant, lost in a labyrinth of his own paranoid fantasies. When death finally came for Ramesses III, it was almost a relief for his long-suffering subjects. The pharaoh's body was hastily embalmed and entombed in a modest pyramid, his name and deeds quickly forgotten by a population too traumatized to mourn his passing. In the end, his legacy was one of cruelty, brutality, and despair, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of a tyrant. As the years passed, the story of Ramesses III faded into legend, a dark chapter in Egypt's long and storied history. But the scars of his reign would linger for generations, a haunting reminder of the horrors that could be unleashed by a ruler consumed by his own twisted desires. And so, as we look back on the cruel pharaohs of ancient Egypt, we are reminded of the fragility of power and the ever-present danger of its abuse. From the brutal conquests of Thutmose III to the religious fanaticism of Akhenaten, from the ruthless ambition of Ramesses II to the paranoid brutality of Ramesses III, these rulers left a legacy of pain and suffering that echoed through the ages. Yet even in the darkest of times, there were those who dared to resist the tide of cruelty and oppression. Brave souls who stood up for justice and compassion, who fought to preserve the spark of hope and humanity in a world consumed by darkness. Their names may be lost to history, but their courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten. And so, as we reflect on the lessons of the past, let us strive to build a world where power is tempered by wisdom, where cruelty is met with compassion, and where the light of hope can never be extinguished. For in the end, it is not the might of armies or the wealth of nations that will shape our destiny, but the strength of our character and the depth of our humanity. The story of ancient Egypt is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty and suffering, we have the capacity to rise above our baser instincts and build a better world. It is a lesson that echoes through the ages, a call to action for all those who believe in the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to that promise and to the hope that guides us through the darkness. For in the end, it is not the pharaohs and their cruelty that define us, but the quiet strength and resilience of the human heart. And as long as that heart beats with the pulse of compassion and the rhythm of hope, we will never be truly lost. So let us dream of a world where cruelty is but a distant memory, and where the light of wisdom and understanding shines bright against the darkness. A world where the legacy of the pharaohs is not one of fear and despair, but of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest of challenges. And let us wake to the promise of a new day, a day of hope, of healing, and of the boundless potential that lies within us all. As Akhenaten descended deeper into his religious fervor, his actions grew increasingly erratic and cruel. The once vibrant city of Thebes, the traditional capital of Egypt, bore the brunt of his wrath. The pharaoh ordered the closure of the temples dedicated to the old gods, their names and images to be chiseled off the walls. Centuries of history erased in a matter of days at the command of a king consumed by his own zeal. But Akhenaten's cruelty extended far beyond mere vandalism. The priests who refused to convert to the worship of Aten faced a terrible fate. The lucky ones were stripped of their positions and cast out into the streets, left to fend for themselves in a world turned upside down. But for those who dared to openly defy the pharaoh, the consequences were far more gruesome. Imagine, if you will, being dragged before the king himself, forced to kneel at the feet of the man who claimed to be the living embodiment of a god. Akhenaten's eyes would glitter with a fanatic light as he pronounced judgment upon the trembling priest. Perhaps he would order the man's tongue cut out as punishment for speaking the names of the old gods. Or maybe he would sentence him to be flayed alive, his skin peeled away, strip by agonizing strip, until nothing remained but raw, bleeding muscle. Such was the fate of those who dared to defy the will of Akhenaten. Even the pharaoh's own family was not safe from his cruel whims. His wife, Nefertiti, once beloved and influential, found herself increasingly sidelined as Akhenaten's obsession with Aten grew. Some say she dared to speak out against her husband's actions, pleading with him to show mercy to their suffering subjects. For her troubles, she was banished from the royal court, exiled to a distant palace where she lived out the rest of her days in lonely isolation. But perhaps the cruelest act of all was Akhenaten's decision to abandon Thebes altogether. In a move that stunned his court and his people, the pharaoh ordered the construction of a new capital city, one that would be dedicated solely to the worship of Aten. He named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and commanded that it be built in a desolate stretch of desert, far from the lush banks of the Nile. Thousands of laborers were conscripted to work on the new city, toiling beneath the blazing desert sun to erect temples, palaces, and towering statues of Akhenaten and his god. Many succumbed to exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke, their bodies left where they fell in the sand. Those who survived lived in squalid conditions, crammed into hastily constructed hovels with little access to food or water. All the while, Akhenaten lived in opulent splendor, his palace a gleaming beacon in the midst of the desert wasteland. He would stand on his balcony and survey his new kingdom, a twisted smile playing across his lips as he watched his subjects toil and suffer in the name of his god. It's said that at night, the wind would carry the sound of weeping from the workers' hovels, a haunting chorus of despair that echoed through the empty streets of Akhenaten. But Akhenaten remained unmoved, secure in his belief that he was doing the will of Aten, no matter how many lives were destroyed in the process. In the end, Akhenaten's grand vision for his new capital was never fully realized. After his death, his successors wasted no time in abandoning Akhenaten and returning to Thebes, eager to erase all traces of the heretic king and his cruel legacy. The once grand city was left to crumble beneath the desert sands, a haunting reminder of the madness and cruelty of a pharaoh who believed himself to be a god. As we reflect on the reign of Akhenaten, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer scale of his cruelty. Here was a man who wielded immense power, who could have used his influence to better the lives of his people. Instead, he chose to unleash untold suffering in the name of his own religious obsession. It's a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of what can happen when a leader becomes consumed by their own ego and loses sight of their duty to those they govern. Akhenaten may have believed himself to be a god, but in the end, he was all too human, a deeply flawed and cruel man whose legacy would forever be stained by the blood of innocents. The story of Akhenaten is a cautionary tale, a warning of the perils of blind fanaticism and the importance of holding our leaders accountable for their actions. It's a lesson that echoes through the ages, as relevant today as it was in the time of the pharaohs. But as we ponder these weighty themes, let us not forget the human toll of Akhenaten's cruelty. The thousands of lives shattered, the families torn apart, the dreams destroyed in the name of one man's twisted vision. It's a heavy burden to bear, even from the distance of centuries. And so, as we let the tale of Akhenaten drift through our minds, let us hold a moment of silence for those who suffered under his reign, for the priests who lost their tongues, for the laborers who lost their lives, for the family that lost a wife and mother. They may be long gone, but their pain and their sacrifice will never be forgotten. In the grand tapestry of Egyptian history, Akhenaten's reign was but a brief and bloody chapter, but it is a chapter that still has the power to haunt us, to make us question the very nature of power and the responsibilities of those who wield it. And as we finally allow ourselves to slip into the embrace of sleep, perhaps we can take some small comfort in the knowledge that no matter how dark the night may seem, the sun will always rise again. Just as the people of Egypt endured the cruelty of Akhenaten, so too shall we endure the trials and tribulations of our own lives. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the pharaohs, not their wealth or their power, but the resilience and strength of the human spirit in the face of even the greatest adversity. It's a lesson worth remembering, even in our darkest moments. And so, let us bid good night to the ghosts of ancient Egypt, secure in the knowledge that their stories will continue to teach and inspire us, even from the distant reaches of history. May your dreams be filled with the beauty and wonder of this timeless land, untouched by the cruelty of those who once ruled over it. As we turn our attention now to the chaotic period that followed Akhenaten's reign, we find ourselves in a world turned upside down. With the heretic king gone, Egypt was left to grapple with the aftermath of his cruel and disruptive rule. It was a time of uncertainty and upheaval, as various factions vied for power in the vacuum left by Akhenaten's death. Into this tumultuous landscape stepped a man who would come to be known as Ramesses III. A skilled warrior and shrewd politician, Ramesses saw an opportunity to seize control of Egypt and restore order to the land. But his rise to power was far from smooth, marked by a series of bloody conspiracies and ruthless acts of vengeance. It's said that Ramesses was first targeted by a group of assassins while he was still a prince, loyal to the old gods and the traditional ways of Egypt. They saw in him a threat to their power and influence, and so they hatched a plot to eliminate him before he could take the throne. But Rameses was not so easily dispatched. With the help of his loyal bodyguards, he managed to fend off the assassins and escape with his life. But the attempt on his life had only hardened his resolve to claim his rightful place as pharaoh. As he set about consolidating his power, Rameses found himself beset on all sides by enemies and conspirators. There were those who still clung to the old gods and resented his efforts to restore the traditional religion of Egypt. There were rival factions within the court who sought to undermine his authority and seize power for themselves. And there were even members of his own family who plotted against him, seeing in his rise a threat to their own ambitions. But Rameses was a man of iron will and ruthless determination. He met each challenge head-on, dispatching his enemies with brutal efficiency. Those who dared to oppose him soon learned the price of their defiance, as Rameses unleashed a wave of terror and repression across the land. He ordered the execution of anyone suspected of plotting against him, their bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning to others. He had his own family members tortured and exiled, sending a clear message that not even blood ties would protect those who stood in his way. And he launched a series of military campaigns to crush any remaining pockets of resistance, leaving a trail of destruction and suffering in his wake. Through it all, Rameses remained convinced of his own righteousness, believing that he was acting in the best interests of Egypt. He saw himself as a savior, a strong and decisive leader who could guide his people through the chaos and restore order to the land. But even as he tightened his grip on power, Rameses could not escape the specter of his own cruelty. The suffering he inflicted on his people left deep scars on the psyche of Egypt, scars that would take generations to heal. And his own legacy would be forever tainted by the blood he had spilled in his quest for power. As we reflect on the rise of Rameses III, it's hard not to be struck by the cycles of violence and cruelty that seem to repeat themselves throughout history. Time and again, we see leaders who are willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in the pursuit of their own ambitions, leaving a trail of destruction and suffering in their wake. It's a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding our leaders accountable for their actions. For every Rameses who manages to seize control through brutality and fear, there are countless innocent lives shattered and communities torn apart. But perhaps there is also a glimmer of hope to be found in the story of Rameses III. For even in the darkest of times, there will always be those who refuse to submit to cruelty and oppression. There will always be those who stand up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a lesson worth remembering, even as we drift off into the peaceful embrace of sleep. That no matter how dark the night may seem, there is always the promise of a new dawn on the horizon, and that even in the face of the greatest adversity, the human spirit will always find a way to endure and overcome. So let us hold fast to that hope, even as we ponder the grim tales of pharaohs and their cruelty. Let us remember that for every act of violence and oppression, there are countless acts of kindness, compassion, and courage. And let us strive to be the kind of people who bring more light into the world, even in the darkest of times. As we come to the end of our journey through the annals of ancient Egypt's cruelest pharaohs, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the lessons we can glean from their stories. Throughout this series, we've explored the reigns of some of the most brutal and tyrannical rulers in Egyptian history, from the first dynasty's merciless King Jer to the religious zealot Akhenaten to the bloodthirsty Rameses III. Each of these pharaohs, in their own way, embodied the dangers of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of absolute authority. They ruled with an iron fist, crushing any opposition and inflicting untold suffering on their subjects in the pursuit of their own grandiose visions and personal ambitions. But perhaps the most striking theme that emerges from these stories is the cyclical nature of cruelty and violence. Time and again, we see pharaohs who rise to power through brutality and bloodshed, only to sow the seeds of their own downfall through their continued acts of oppression and tyranny. It's a pattern that plays out across history, from ancient Egypt to the modern day. Leaders who are willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in the pursuit of power may enjoy a brief moment of triumph, but their reigns are ultimately built on a foundation of suffering and instability. And sooner or later that foundation will crumble, leaving behind a legacy of pain and destruction. But even in the face of such grim realities, there is still reason for hope. For every cruel pharaoh who left a trail of blood and tears in their wake, there were countless ordinary Egyptians who continued to live their lives with resilience, compassion, and grace. They tended to their crops, raised their families, and found joy and meaning in the simple pleasures of life, even in the shadow of tyranny and oppression. And it's in their stories, too often lost to history, that we can find the true measure of the human spirit. The farmers who toiled under the blistering sun to feed their families, the artisans who crafted works of stunning beauty in the midst of chaos and upheaval, the parents who taught their children to be kind and just in a world that so often rewarded cruelty and brutality. These are the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt, the ones who may not have had the power or the wealth of the pharaohs, but who nonetheless shaped the course of history in their own quiet ways. And it's in their example that we can find inspiration and hope, even in the darkest of times. So, as we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to the memory of those everyday Egyptians and the countless others throughout history who have faced adversity with courage and compassion. Let us remember that even in the face of the greatest cruelty and injustice, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience and renewal. And let us strive to be the kind of people who bring more light into the world, even in the darkest of times. For in the end, that is the true measure of our humanity. Not the wealth we accumulate or the power we wield, but the love and compassion we show to one another, and the legacy of kindness and decency we leave behind. So good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with visions of a brighter tomorrow. A tomorrow where cruelty and tyranny are but distant memories, and where the enduring spirit of our shared humanity shines through like the eternal sun over the sands of ancient Egypt. Welcome back to our journey through the annals of ancient Egyptian history, where we've been exploring the reigns of some of the cruelest pharaohs to ever rule the land of the Nile. As we drift deeper into the past, let's turn our attention now to one of the most notorious and bloodthirsty pharaohs of them all, Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II, the seventh pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, was a man consumed by his own ego and a lust for power. He came to the throne around 1427 BC, inheriting a prosperous and stable kingdom from his father, Thutmose III. But while Thutmose had been a brilliant military commander who expanded Egypt's borders, Amenhotep seemed more interested in proving his own might and asserting his dominance over his subjects. From a young age, Amenhotep was known for his physical prowess and skill in sports and warfare. Ancient texts describe him as a champion archer, boasting that he could pierce copper targets with his arrows and even shoot an arrow clean through a thick copper ingot. He was said to be able to row a boat faster than 200 men and was a fearsome charioteer. But this strength and athleticism belied a cruel streak that would come to define his reign. Amenhotep seemed to take sadistic pleasure in subjugating and humiliating those weaker than himself. He was known to personally lead captured enemy soldiers back to Egypt, bound at the neck and forced to run behind his chariot. Depictions show him brutally smiting his foes, even clutching them by the hair as he prepares to strike them down. This cruelty extended to his own people as well. Amenhotep had a vicious temper and was quick to order severe punishments for even minor transgressions. Slaves and servants lived in constant fear of incurring his wrath. He once had a servant's hand cut off merely for stumbling and touching the pharaoh's crown. Another time, he ordered a noblewoman to be stripped naked and publicly beaten for speaking out of turn in his presence. But perhaps the most chilling example of Amenhotep's cruelty was his treatment of the so-called Asiatics, the Egyptian term for the people of Syria and Palestine. During his reign, Amenhotep led several military campaigns into these lands, conquering and sacking cities with ruthless efficiency. Surviving inscriptions boast of the great slaughter he unleashed, killing countless men and capturing thousands of women and children to be brought back to Egypt as slaves. In one particularly grim account, Amenhotep orders the capture of several hundred young boys from a defeated city. He then has them marched back to Egypt, where they are mutilated and sacrificed in a mass